This paper on IIA Faynan and early Edom is a summary of a paper of mine that's appearing in Basel sometime in 2022. Now, as we all know, the final report on the Edom Lowlands Regional Archaeological Project, or LRAP, argues that Edom did not emerge as a state-level society in the late 8th to 7th centuries BCE on the Highland Plateau under Assyrian influence. There's a map of Edom on the left. Rather, a nomadic tribal society in the lowlands of Edom at Faynan, in the map on the right, specializing in copper production, adapted and grew into a small, complex society already in the 10th and 9th centuries BCE in early Iron II. This society in Faynan had a key role in the rise of social complexity and the later expansion of settlement into the highlands. And more recently, the argument has been extended to include Timna, so that both Faynan and Timna are seen as part of the Edomite kingdom already in the 10th century BCE. We can call this the early Edom hypothesis, and this explicitly connects the copper-producing complex society of early Iron II lowlands Faynan and Timna with the later polity of Highlands Edom, as the quote there indicates. The purpose of this paper is to review if there is indeed evidence for connection and continuity between the early Iron II activities at Faynan and the later settlements in the highlands, which would support the idea that the Edomite kingdom developed from the copper-producing society of early Iron II Faynan. Now, in an effort to be systematic, I propose that if the early Edom hypothesis is true, there are 4 types of archaeological evidence that we would expect to find. Some element of chronological continuity between early Iron II lowlands Faynan and the late Iron II settlements on the Highland Plateau, rather than a gap. Continuing increase in administrative control and social complexity at early Iron II Faynan. Continuity of technology between early and later Iron II mining at Faynan to check that we are looking at organic indigenous development and not the activities of completely different groups. And fourthly, some similarity of settlement patterns between early Iron II Faynan and the later Iron II Highlands to support the idea of continuity and emergence. So let's go through these 4 one at a time, starting with the question of chronological continuity. The evidence presented by LRAP is that there is a clear chronological gap between the end of copper production and the abandonment of Khirbet al-Nahas at the end of the 9th century BCE, and the 7th to 6th century BCE structures at Rujum Hamra Ifdan and Ras Al Mia, and those 3 sites that I've mentioned, I've marked with red crosses on the slide. And this gap lasted at least 100 years and possibly longer. Outside Faynan, LRAP obtained radiocarbon dates from soundings at 3 highland sites. Now, I acknowledge that the dating situation is not straightforward. The radiocarbon dates from these 3 highland sites centre in the 8th to 6th centuries BCE. But as you see on the right, they fall slightly into the very end of the 9th century, and the very early date from the single sample at Tawilan is accepted as a probable outlier. But the fluctuations in the radiocarbon calibration curve during the 8th and 7th centuries BCE are a recognised problem, and the excavators accept that definite conclusions about dating based on radiocarbon dates are impossible at present. But here is where it gets confusing. In one part of the LRAP final report, they conclude that these highland sites were occupied from the early 8th century BCE in column 1. But in another part of the final report, they date them to the late 8th to 6th centuries BC, in line with the currently accepted dating of the late Iron Age in Edom, and that's in column 2. To make it even more confusing, recently Piotr van der Veen has dated Edomite pottery no earlier than the 7th century BCE, and that's in column 3. We therefore have 3 chronological possibilities. Firstly, the gap between the abandonment of Khirbet an-Nahas at the end of the 9th century BCE and the settlement of the Edomite plateau in the 7th century was in excess of 100 years, and that's column 3. Secondly, the gap from the abandonment of Faynan in the late 9th century BCE is smaller, but still potentially 50 years or more, and that's column 1. And thirdly, the gap between early Iron II Faynan and the late Iron II settlements was around 100 years. Now, since not a single Edomite vessel has been found at sites in the Negev in strata earlier than the late 8th century BCE, it is strong evidence for the late 8th century as a terminus post quem for late Iron II settlement in Edom. And this dating is still to be preferred, and that's the dating in column 2. So uncertainties about dating remain, but whichever scenario we choose, as you see from the 3 columns, there is a clear chronological gap in the Faynan region itself between the copper-producing society of the 10th to 9th centuries and the 7th to 6th century BCE structures at Rujum Hamra Ifdan and Ras Al Mia. This indicates that there was no continuity between early and late Iron II, even within Faynan itself. And regionally, there is also at least some chronological gap between early Iron II lowlands Faynan and the late Iron II highlands settlements. Despite this gap, the LRAP report tried to claim that there was a continuous pottery tradition in Edom from early to late Iron II, what they termed a long use horizon, with close parallels between early and late Iron II pottery. But they had misidentified late Iron II pottery at Nahas from an ephemeral later reuse. So this wasn't early Iron II pottery paralleled in late Iron II, it was actual late Iron II pottery. As this table shows, this is pottery at Nahas that is only paralleled at Rujum Hamra Ifdan B and Ras Al Mia in Faynan, which are closed late Iron II assemblages, and it's also paralleled in Highland sites, but there are no parallels to Rujum Hamra Ifdan A, which is a closed early Iron II assemblage. Because of the chronological gap of 50 to 100 years, there is no continuous tradition and no long horizon. What we actually have are 2 short use horizons in the pottery at Nahas and wider Faynan, early Iron II and late Iron II, with a gap in between. So let's now move on to the question of increasing complexity. If the early Iron II copper producing society of Faynan marked the beginnings of complex social and organizational processes that led eventually to the development of the Kingdom of Edom, we would expect evidence of continuing social and organizational complexity at Faynan. However, the published evidence from Khirbet an-Nahas is quite unambiguous that even before that gap, there had been a decrease in administrative complexity and control. All of the monumental buildings at Khirbet an-Nahas, interpreted by the excavators as elite residences with an administrative function, were short-lived, and they are highlighted in this table. All of them were constructed in the 10th century BCE. The Area R building had gone out of use by the late 10th century, and the areas A and T buildings had gone out of use by the early 9th century BCE. Juan Manuel Tebes has recently suggested that some of them were first constructed in the 9th, not the 10th century, but as far as I can see, his redating does not affect their end date early in the 9th century. And there is no evidence of any elite or administrative buildings that replaced them. The evidence therefore indicates that copper production continued for most of the 9th century BCE, but without the layer of the administration that had been present in the 10th century BCE. There are also no residential structures at Khirbet an-Nahas following the early 9th century BCE, as you can see in the right-hand column of the table. None of this is evidence of the beginnings of a more complex polity. It is evidence instead of less complexity, less control, and less sedentism, and of the winding down of a short-lived society based entirely on intensive copper production. So, the question of technological continuity. If the early Iron II copper producing society in Faynan was the genesis of the later Edomite polity, we might reasonably expect evidence of continuity or similarity in copper production techniques between early and late Iron II, or at the very least, some indication that we are looking at organic indigenous development and not the activities of completely different groups. Now, there is evidence for some copper production in the Faynan region in the late Iron II period. So the questions are, how do the technologies compare to those of the early Iron II period? And what conclusions can be drawn from this comparison? Evidence shows that late Iron II copper production in Faynan was minimal. The sophisticated networks of ore extraction and processing documented for the early Iron II period had ceased to exist. Late Iron II copper production in Faynan can be characterized as domestic and on a very small scale, not industrial like that of early Iron II. Late Iron II copper production also employed much simpler technology with small-scale smelting, and in fact, the excavators conclude that the advanced technology of massive production known from early Iron II may have been forgotten. There is evidence from both Timna and Faynan for different groups or tribes exploiting copper, some without knowledge of advanced smelting or the required organization of production. So even during the early Iron II period, different tribes with different levels of technical knowledge were exploiting the copper in different parts of the Faynan region. The society with its center at Khirbet an-Nahas may have been just one tribal group with sophisticated technical knowledge, but there were others with more primitive knowledge. The simple, small-scale technology used in the late Iron II period in the vicinity of Ras Al Miah was unrelated to the complex industrial-scale technology of early Iron II. It is likely to represent the activities of a discrete tribe without advanced technical knowledge. There is, therefore, no evidence of any continuity or connection with the copper-producing society of early Iron II Faynan. The evidence suggests instead that the late Iron II small-scale and simple copper exploitation was undertaken by a completely different group or tribe. So let's move on to the question of settlement patterns. Since there was a chronological gap of 50 to 100 years or so between the abandonment of Faynan at the end of the 9th century BCE and the settlement of the highlands, there was clearly no actual continuity in settlement patterns. The question really is, what evidence do we have that it was indeed the lowland groups who eventually settled in the highlands, rather than other tribes, for example, those already living in the highlands who settled in the areas where they had been practicing pastoralism for generations? So, do settlement patterns provide any evidence at all that the early Iron II groups in Faynan and the late Iron II groups in the highlands are in any way connected in terms of their use of the landscape and cultural approaches to domestic occupation that reflected their social structure? And here I tabulate the two settlement patterns. What are the main differences? Well, firstly, early Iron II Faynan was almost entirely based on industrial scale copper production with few agricultural sites, whereas the late Iron II highlands comprised mostly agricultural settlements, and a contemporary copper production at Faynan was minimal and at a very small scale, technologically simpler level. And secondly, there were no villages or permanent settlement sites in early Iron II Faynan, while in the late Iron II highlands there were a few large sites, but mostly autonomous villages and farms, while at Faynan the only domestic occupation was not autonomous, but part of the copper production site of Khirbet an-Nahas. By any measure, these are vastly different settlement patterns, rooted in completely different economies and ways of living. The very least that we can conclude is that they are not evidence of any connection or continuity between the groups who exploited the copper in early Iron II Faynan and the late Iron II agricultural communities of the highlands. So where does this leave us? The evidence I have reviewed demonstrates a lack of continuity and connection between early Iron II Faynan and late Iron II highland societies in Edom. There was a small, complex society, partly nomadic, based on intensive copper production in Faynan in early Iron II, flourishing in the 10th to 9th centuries BCE. However, it was short-lived and regressive, with evidence for social complexity and administrative control disappearing after the early 9th century BCE. There is no evidence that it was in any way related to the later expansion of agriculturally based settlement during late Iron II in the highlands of Edom. The evidence shows that the later Edomite polity did not emerge from the society of early Iron II Faynan. Early Iron II Faynan was not early Edom. In contrast, there are 5 types of evidence pointing to connections between early Iron II Faynan and the Western Negev. There are architectural parallels, for example, the Area R building at Khirbet an-Nahas and the administrative building at Atar Haroa in the Negev highlands, whose plans are on the slide. They are almost identical, and both went out of use by the mid-9th century BCE. Then there are pottery imports. The most common imports at Khirbet an-Nahas were fineware bowls from the Western Negev, and these types of bowls are commonly found at every early Iron II site in the Western Negev. Then there are pottery parallels. Many of the early Iron II pottery types of Faynan have parallels at contemporary sites in the Western Negev. Then there are imports to the Negev highlands from the copper districts of the Wadi Araba. A substantial proportion of vessels from early Iron II settlements in the Negev highlands were made of slag-tempered ware from Faynan or Timna. Martin and Finkelstein have concluded that some of its local inhabitants participated in copper production at Faynan, and possibly, but less likely, Timna, where they were employed as miners and smelters and transported the pottery back to the Negev highlands. This would also help explain the lack of permanent settlement sites in the Faynan copper district, if the workers were pastoral nomads from the Negev highlands, perhaps working in copper production seasonally. And finally, there are chronological correlations. The peak of social and industrial complexity at Faynan was in the 10th and 9th centuries BCE, the end of copper production probably linked to the renewal of the copper trade with Cyprus. This coincides precisely with the extensive and short-lived early Iron II settlement wave in the Negev highlands. Now, all these correlations have been recognized previously. The contemporaneous prosperity of both areas has been explained as rooted in copper production in the Wadi Araba, an economic boom that stimulated early Iron II settlement in the Negev highlands. So, on the one hand, there is zero evidence connecting early Iron II Faynan to the late Iron II settlement of the Edomite highlands and the Edomite kingdom. On the other hand, there is overwhelming evidence that the short-lived copper-producing society of early Iron II Faynan was linked to the similarly short-lived society, administration and economy of the Negev highlands, with imports going both ways, architectural and pottery parallels, a semi-nomadic workforce travelling between the two areas, an exact contemporaneity of prosperity and decline. Indeed, this is the sort of archaeological evidence that we would expect to see if Faynan and the Negev highlands were part of the same political, social and economic entity. As to the late Iron II settlement of the highlands and the emergence of the Kingdom of Edom, all the data points to the late 8th century BCE as the critical period of development. The processes of intense Assyrian interest, settlement, the Arabian trade, and the production of pottery were all contemporaneous and interlinked. The Kingdom of Edom and late Iron II settlement in the highlands developed in the late 8th century BC in a separate process stimulated by intense Assyrian interest, which had a direct impact on the expansion of settlement and agriculture, the creation of an elite, the production of pottery and other goods, and the Arabian trade across the Negev. Thank you.